Okay, my name is Gil Truitt. I was born and raised in Sitka. My mother was Dorothy James, and my father was Joseph Truitt, Joe Truitt Sr. Both were from Sitka. In our family, there were 3 brothers and 3 sisters. And my father did not have much of an education, but from what I understand, he was very intelligent. And my mother did graduate from elementary school, and she was a student at Sheldon Jackson before it became a high school. And one of her fondest memories was always talking about Dr. Walter Sobolov, because they were classmates and grew up together. And of course, he fished with my father and uncles for a good number of years when he was going to college. Our father met with a very bad tragedy, along with 2 uncles and a cousin. And I was quite young at the time, so I do not recall that much about the father. And when I was 15, my mother also met with the tragedy. So the 3 brothers and 3 sisters, we pretty much separated at that point. And for the most part, we never really got back together. Although in later years, we did meet quite often in reunions, either here in Sitka, but generally in Anchorage. And our family history with the Cottages. But first of all, let me explain. The Cottages was established by the Presbyterian Church in Sheldon Jackson in 1888. And the reason the Cottages was formed, established by the high school and Dr. Sheldon Jackson, was the school did not want the graduates to return home, because they felt the real future of the native people was to stay in places like Sitka and the urban areas where they could become better educated and make a mark in their lives. So people were encouraged to stay here in Sitka after leaving Sheldon Jackson. And as I mentioned, that was 1888. The people who took up that program were supplied with the land, but the men had to build their own homes. So all that's left today of the Cottages are 2 streets, Metlakatla Street and Kathleen Street. Now, when people in the 1880s moved into the Cottages, they had to sign an agreement, really an oath, with the Presbyterian Church and Sheldon Jackson, that they would live a good life with their family, being centered around the Bible and the church. They were to observe the Sabbath, and they were told if they did not observe those 2 very important things, they could be told to move. Also, part of the agreement was alcohol and gambling was out of the question. And many of those who stayed in Sitka became some of the great leaders that we hear about today. And hopefully, if we have time, I might mention some of them. Where leadership among the native people started in the Cottages with of course, the encouragement of Dr. Sheldon Jackson and the Presbyterian Church. My family relationship with the Cottages had to do with my mother, because she was a graduate of Sheldon Jackson Grade School. My maternal grandparents also were graduates or former students of Sheldon Jackson. So they, I think, had a lot. My maternal grandparents had a lot to do, I think, with helping establish the Cottages. Now, in the families in the Cottages, I have to mention 4 sisters back in the 1880s, 1890s. The family name was Sloan, and that's spelled S-L-O-A-N. The oldest of those sisters was Amelia, and she was my great-grandmother. She married Don Cameron. The second oldest was Mary Sloan. She married Peter Simpson. And from that marriage came the Isabel Brady family, the Simpson family, and there are quite a few descendants of that marriage here in Sitka. And the third sister was Lottie Sloan, and she married George Howard from Cake. Now when I read the old newspapers from Sheldon Jackson, the name of that man is listed as Howard George. I don't know which is correct, but we do know that the family today went by the name George Howard. Now from that family, from that marriage, came two brothers, David Howard and George Howard. David has descendants only in Angoon, whereas George Howard has many descendants living here in Sitka, Glenn Howard being one of those. And a girl was also born to that family. Her name was Tilly, and Tilly married Andrew Hope. So most of you, all of you are familiar with the Hope family. There are many here and many throughout different parts of the state. Now my great-grandmother, Amelia Sloan, had two sons, Albert, who was my grandfather, and his brother Raymond, and his sister Olinda. Olinda married the mother of Roy Bailey. She had a family, but none of them survived today. She raised grandchildren, and none of them survived. They all died at a fairly young age.
So your great-grandmother Cameron had two sons?
Yes, Albert and Raymond.
And your grandfather was...
Who?
So your grandfather was Albert?
Albert, yes. Albert James.
And so was that her... so how did the James name come in?
Yeah, I'm getting to that.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Raymond James had a lot of children. Those were my aunts and uncles. Our family and that James family, Raymond James family, were very close, just like one family. And Raymond married Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was from Wrangell. And today there are not too many from that marriage. There's a lady in Juneau, the daughter of that family. And she has a family in Wrangell, descendants in Wrangell. And Bert Adams was the grandson of Ray and Elizabeth James. He lives in Yakutat and has quite a large family, and they come here occasionally. And I should mention about the Cottages. Let me go back to Peter Simpson first.
I'm going to get a notebook to write in. Sorry. I have no more room on this paper. Yeah. Okay. I'm also going to plug in here. There it is. Okay. Sorry. Super.
Okay. Yes, we were going back to the Peter Simpson and Mary Simpson marriage. From that marriage came Louis Simpson, and he had descendants here. When he died, his wife Esther remarried and married Charlie Littlefield. So there's a lot of offspring from that marriage. And a sister to Louis Simpson, the daughter of Peter Simpson and Mary Simpson, was Jenny. And Jenny married Peter Singh. And from that marriage came Henry Singh, Sam Singh, Lucille, and Isabel Singh. We all know Isabel as Isabel Brady. And none of them are alive today. And fourth sister of the Sloan sisters. She was the youngest. Her name was Lily. And she married a former serviceman who was stationed here in Sitka in the 1880s. And his name was Bernard Hurst, Hirst. That's a well-known name in the early history of Sitka. And that marriage brought several children, and all of them went to the Sitka School District, but sometime that family moved from Sitka, and Bernard Hurst established or bought what became the Hurst Chichikov mine north of here, which was quite a settlement. And I'm not certain when Bernard Hurst and his wife Lily left, but they left and moved to the Portland area, and I don't think ever returned to Sitka. But there is a street named after Bernard Hurst, and as I mentioned, was a pretty famous name here in Sitka, especially in business. Now those in my family came from those four Sloan sisters, and all of those families except the George Howard family lived in the Cottages. The George Howard family, or the offspring, George Howard Jr. and David Howard and Tilly Hope, lived in the villages, whereas the other offspring all grew up in the Cottages. And of course we knew all of these people. And I should mention that another relative or family living in the Cottages was John Willard. He was close related to our family, with the members that I mentioned from the Sloan family. And a lot of the people living in the Cottages, including my parents, were quite musical, but I'll mention that in connection with A and B. But in the Cottages, Sheldon Jackson, when it became Sheldon Jackson, they built this hydroelectric plant that furnished electricity not only to the high school but also to the families living in the Cottages. And sometime, I think in the late 30s, Sheldon Jackson stopped supplying electricity. And most of the homes in the Cottages did not have running water or indoor plumbing. So in order to have drinking water, water that you needed, that had to be packed from Indian River. It was quite a daily chore. And of course, without indoor plumbing, after we got those things, we saw how important they are and were at the time. Of course, our family did not. We were the only family in the Cottages did not have any of those things. We had electricity, but nothing else.
So when did you get running water? Or when did you get water, running water?
We did not.
Oh, you never did?
Most of the people got it in the early 40s. And most people at the Cottages were also, well, everybody cut wood and chopped wood. And most people in the 1940s were switching to fuel oil. First was coal, but our family was the only one that burned wood. And I'm sure there were other families like ours in the village. So the fact that we were out in the cottage did not, and I'll get back to that, to isolate us from the rest of the town. And one of the questions asked, which I will mention something before I talk about growing up in the Cottages. I've been asked a number of times if we were allowed to speak our language. That was never a question, because the only language we heard in the Cottages was English. And when I look back, I'm almost certain that the older people got together and made a decision. They all could speak Tlingit, that it would be a language they would not use. We never heard it. Matter of fact, I take that back. If we were going to get spanked, we knew what spanking meant. That was about the only thing that we really knew. But
So,
it's never,
so when they were seriously angry at you,
yeah, we knew.
they would use
And
Tlingit.
they didn't speak us, they used one word that meant we're going to be spanked.
What was the word, do you remember?
I can't remember. There's several I don't remember. But we knew what was coming. And most of the homes had strict rules, like breakfast was at 7, lunch was at noon, supper was at 5. And you didn't dare be late to any of those because you got the paddle. It was not just a tap, we were spanked. And those spankings, I think, helped. But I had cousins living with Mrs. Don Cameron, Amelia Sloan. She could not speak English, but those two young men were very fluent in Tlingit, but we never heard them speak until years later. Then a neighbor, 2 houses away, an elderly couple, raised 2 or 3 young ladies. And they spoke Tlingit, but we never heard it around the cottages. But it's obvious that they spoke it in the home, because those 3 young ladies today speak Tlingit very fluently. One of them is Jean Bartolaba's mother, who lives in Juneau. And those young ladies were adopted by Mr. and Mrs. George Hobson, the elderly couple. But we never heard them speak English. We just never heard that at all. And I think one of the reasons they might have decided not to speak the language was they might have felt it might have been a hindrance. Because in my experience in the grade school, not far from here, the old BIA school, we had some young people who had a very difficult time speaking English. As a result, they got way behind. It just about every one of them dropped out of school because English to them was a very difficult language. There are 2 streets still in the cottages, Metlakatla Street and Kelly Street. Metlakatla Street is where I grew up. There were rows of homes on both sides of the road. The side where my home was is no longer, the houses are no longer there. I'm not sure when they were torn down. To me, there were a lot of sad things within our family in the cottages. So I went to Wrangell Institute, and when I came, our house was pretty well deteriorated. So I went in the military. When I returned, there was nothing left. So for years, I never went out to the cottages because it brought back some memories that were not too good. But our home was we were the last house on the right-hand side as you look towards the mountains. Next to us was the Jimmy Williams family. All of you know Martha Reinman. Well, that was her household. And next to them was the George Hobson family I mentioned. Then the Louis Simpson family was next to the Hobsons. Then the William Wells family was next. And just below the William Wells family was Amelia Sloan, my great-grandmother. Today, that place is occupied by the entrance to the Park Service. When we were growing up, that was a vacant area, a good play area, and I'll talk about growing up in the cottages and how we used that play area. On the other side of the street, right across our home, was a hall that was built in the 1890s. It was the only big hall in Sitka. It was built by the people living in the cottages. And I've read where they had big banquets and band concerts that seated 350 people. And that hall was a meeting place. It was used by the whole community. And I might mention that was the first place that basketball was played, the only place big enough.
What are your memories of that hall? Do you remember that hall?
Yeah, no, it was gone by the time I came around. And the reason it was gone, some of the younger men went south to school. When they returned, they taught the people how to dance, the social dance. So they had dances in that hall. And from what I was told, it didn't go too well with the Presbyterian church. So they took the hall away, locked it up, and eventually that hall fell. But at the time when that was happening, Peter Simpson said, we will build our own hall. That's when they started talking. Well, he used to come down to the village and tell the people, this village needs a hall. So when that hall at the Cottages was taken away, that's when the talk really began about building the A and B hall, which was built in 1914, then enlarged in 1928. But next to that hall, matter of fact, when I was growing up, that whole area was vacant. You could see the piling that the hall had set on. In addition, we could see an old stove that was almost as long as this room. It was still, it had fallen through and was rusting. And I think that might still be visible. But it was a sad thing among the people. They talked about how bad it was to lose the hall. But
So,
that's how strict, the oath was, and how the Presbyterians felt that the people living out there had taken that oath, and dancing was one thing that was not to be allowed. Matter of fact, Sheldon Jackson School didn't allow it until the 1950s. And I think that also led to the demise of Sheldon Jackson High School.
how was that?
Because, well, Sheldon Jackson was a very special school and had rules that were enforced, and parents sent their youngsters to the school knowing they'd be safe. So when they became liberal and relaxing on the rules, those parents stopped sending the young people to Sheldon Jackson. And that was in the late 60s. We saw the enrollment drop to where it really had to close, talking about the high school.
So you feel like when they started having dances, that didn't go over well with the parents?
With the parents. It was a special school. And people bragged about going to Sheldon Jackson, standards that they had set. And I'll mention that in connection with its relationship to Mount Edgecumbe. Let's see, I'm talking about that all next to it was the Roscoe Max family. And many of that family lived here in Sitka today.
Can you tell me where, so Herman Kitka's home, was that the, was that the last house before the hall?
So what?
So Herman Kitka's home,
Oh, I'm getting to
was that, so that was a couple down?
Yes,
Okay.
Yeah, I'm getting to that and going down the street. And that the next family was the James family. It's the Ray James family, the one I mentioned being very close. That is a sad case to that family. The whole family just demolished within a few years. Maybe demolish is the wrong. They had accidents and were gone within a short period of time. That was my family also.
So was that Carol Feller Brady's
Yes,
family?
Carol Feller Brady's parents and her brothers and sisters. And there really aren't that many from that family, descendants today. Years later, Herman Kitka bought that home and moved the house back a few feet, and I think built another one. But next to that James family was the Alfred Gordon home. Alfred Gordon was originally from Metlakatla. So was his wife. Next to that was the Peter Simpson home. That's where Isabel Brady grew up. And I think that home is still there, although it's been remodeled. And just next to it, below it, was the John Willard home. John Willard did not have children of his own, but he adopted people, young people. And below that, and the next one is, the house is still there. That's the Louis Shotridge home. Louis Simpson Jr. owns that home today. It's a gray house. It always has been painted gray. And Louis, that was one of the nicest homes in Sitka when I was young. And Louis Shotridge, either of you may know that he did a lot of work in trying to preserve native art with the University of Pennsylvania. He was one of few people in Sitka at the time who owned a car, had a big garage across the street, bigger than most homes. And just below that was the Peter Simpson Boat Shop, which was a great place to play and to visit.
So do you have memories of boats being built there?
Oh yes, great memories of Peter Simpson. Peter Simpson was one of the finest, one of the greatest individuals I've known, because he took a great interest in people, in young people especially, encouraging the young people that education is going to be the key. Education and citizenship. He also made a speech at Sheldon Jackson that's been recorded, that he told the student body in his speech that it's time for our people to move from the old way and move to the new, because the time is coming. Unless we do that, we're going to get left behind. And even when I was growing up, he talked to us about how important an education is going to be. And citizenship. We already had citizenship, but he still talked to us about it. He said, unless you do these things, you get an education, unless you get it, life is going to be difficult. So we heard that quite often. He took the time to sit down and visit with us. Under his shop, there's space about this high. There's a big rock that's still on the beach. Where the road is, that's where the entrance of the shop is. It went out to that rock. And there's a lot of space underneath the shop. That was a great place to play. And a lot of times he heard us under there and would come down and sit there and visit with us. And we do remember him building the two brothers. We remember the SJS. And we remember rowboats that he built. Now, I might mention too, when I went to Sheldon Jackson, I took boat building under him and worked for him a number of times in his shop and knew him fairly well. We always addressed him only as Mr. Simpson or Andrew Hope, Mr. Hope. That's the way we were raised. Or ladies addressed him as Mrs., unless they told us differently.
And just to go back, so how was John Willard related to your family?
He was just a part of the group. He came originally from Tuckwan, as did Don Cameron. It was his wife who was related to the Sloans. Now, I might mention they were really a great couple. If you think of people being church-oriented, they were a good example.
This is the Camerons.
No, the Willards.
So his wife was
Related to
related.
the Sloans.
So his wife was also from Klukwan
No,
or
she was from here.
from Sitka. Okay.
Yes. A kind, a great lady.
And I remember seeing an old photo that shows Mr. and Mrs. Sloan,
Yes,
like the
that's the
parents.
family. Most
Where-
of it,
Where were they from?
they're from here.
Okay.
Yes.
And let's see.
The people in the cottages were musically inclined. Most of the households that I mentioned on Metlakatla Street were members of the A and B band. Everyone in the James family played a musical instrument. My great-grandfather, Albert, and his wife, I forgot to mention that he was married to Pauline Catley-Ann. You know, are all familiar with the Catley-Ann name. Well, that's the family that our maternal grandparents came from. But they also were musically inclined, as were my mother and father, the whole James family, the Alfred Willard family, the John Willards, the Louis Shotridge. And the band leader in the early days was John Willard. Eventually his place was taken by Alfred Gordon, who I mentioned earlier. And I'm talking about A and B band.
Okay, so Alfred Gordon, I don't remember how.
They lived next door to the
Oh.
great James family.
And so, what was your family? Because you were saying your father died when you were too young to remember.
I was
And-
too young, but I remember we were very young, but old enough to know, the tragedy.
So then you and your siblings were living with your mother,
Yeah,
And
we
your-
stayed with her until she was gone.
and are you the oldest?
No,
Or-
had an older brother and had a sister, Nancy. She was next to my brother, Alvin, then Jake, then Corrine, and Mildred. Now they're all gone.
So how many children? So is that so? 6?
There were 7 of us,
7?
yes. I had 3 brothers and 3 sisters.
And so after your father died, you were living with your mother and your grandparents?
No, just our
Or-
mother.
Just your mother.
Yes, she had a difficult time. I think I mentioned that only once. Not as deep as I mentioned here. When I was on a panel during the clan conference, I did mention that life was not easy and that we were orphaned at age 15. That was the extent of what I said. Publicly, I've never talked about it. Now, I might mention too that I asked my sister Nancy one time, why is it we never talked about it? It was there. Well, she said we had to go on with our lives. We couldn't sit here and dwell on it. Otherwise, it could have gotten us down and we would have stayed at that level. And that's really what happened, just moved on. But we never forgot what happened.
So do you feel now that that was the right thing to do, or?
Yes. Because from our family, had a youngest sister, Corrine. She's retired as a teacher. Her daughter is a doctor in Juneau today. Had 2 brothers, younger brothers, who became engineers. But we never talked about the tragedies, and I think it was good.
So I wonder too, maybe it was an attitude. That like if you had, maybe you had an attitude of moving forward. Maybe that was something that you got from your family to not look backwards, but to look forward, you know, to have some kind of confidence in the future.
Well, I think what really helped is we had to struggle to survive. And if we stopped, we wouldn't be here today. And people often ask, you know, about culture. Well, when I was growing up, people were too busy making a living. Life was hard. People were too busy trying to survive. And that occupied most of our time. One of the things, good things, matter of fact, that's the only sad things I remember, but there were a lot of good things that happened in the cottages. I used to, for years, I wondered why some of us went in what were sealing boats. They were big boats that were used. Why we would go over from the cottages to the islands that you see for all-day picnics. But when I started thinking about it years later, it was the families that I mentioned here. The James family, the Simpson family, the Singh family, the Willards. I used to wonder, but I'm sure now it was because it was family. But that was a good thing. The James family, on weather like this, they would come out of their house and sit on their porch and start playing their music instruments. And all these people I mentioned played different instruments. Well, they would start it. Pretty soon people from the various homes would start coming. Pretty soon you had a band concert. And the women would start getting tables set and end up being a picnic. Those were the real good times. But I should also mention that there were 2 or 3 families that were destroyed by alcohol.
So, and that was, and the Presbyterians could have kicked people out? Did they ever kick anybody out?
No, I don't think so. By the time I grew up, all those things about rooms were forgotten. And there's that tie with Sheldon Jackson was gone. But I'll mention how the cottage fit in with Sheldon Jackson.
So did people, how did the cottage families make a living? Was there a lot of subsistence? Or?
Yeah, I'll talk about subsistence later, but most people went out purse seining, or trolling, or just fishing. The James family owned a fishing boat. My father fished with those 2 brothers, Ray and John, my uncles. Walter Sobolov was the cook, and Andrew Hope was the skipper. That was their crew for years, and they worked hard. And when fishing was gone, men were lucky to find jobs, but my dad always seemed to have a job. I was quite young when he started working at the Pioneer Home construction, from the first day to the last day. He also helped build Conway Dock from the first day to the last day, which meant he didn't go out seining, purse seining, because he felt it was much better to be receiving a check rather than depending on seining. But a lot of people had a hard time finding work. And that's one of the reasons subsistence became very important. We were lucky out at the cottages. The best place for subsistence was on the beach of Totem Park. You caught a lot of fish. There are different types of fish. There are clams, cockles, smelt, and sometimes crabs. It was easy to get the food. It was also easy to find deer. Sometimes where we were staying, we'd look out the window and there'd be a deer across the street. And my brother would get out his .22 and would shoot it from there, and we'd drag it to the house. Of course, that was against the law. But deer was plentiful. You didn't have to go a long way to find deer.
So who are the families on Kelly Street? Did
Well,
that have houses on both sides?
Yeah, let me get on Kelly Street.
Oh.
At the top of the street was Mark Jacobs' family. And of course, there are a lot of descendants of that family. And Mark Jacobs Sr. was another individual who spent time talking to young people, encouraging young people always to do the right thing. And something that others never said was to go to church. Next to him was the Anderson family, and there are descendants living here in Sitka today. And next to them was the Ralph Young, Frank Price, and John Newell family.
So that's one home?
No,
Or,
they were
okay, three.
side by side. There are no descendants from the Price family in Sitka. The Newell family, that's where the Max family came from. Today, Edith Mort is one of the Max girls. So a good number still live here in Sitka.
So was that, so Martin Strand, was that what
Martin
he
Strand
led?
came from the Newell family. And below them was the Charles Daniels family. And a good number of descendants live here in Sitka. Charles Daniels Jr., Josephine Jones and her sisters, Josephine Jones Patterson. And that's, I think some of the people living out there who live by the code, by the agreement to observe the Sabbath, was Peter Simpson, faithfully, William Wells, very devout Christian, the John Willard family, the Price family, the Newell family, and the Young families. Now, I might mention to you that some of us went to Sunday school faithfully. That guy stopped going in the 7th grade.
Why was that?
I really don't know why. I was thinking about that today.
So you went to school, you went to school to the Native Public School down here?
That's the next thing I talk about.
Oh.
At the time it was called the Alaska Native Service, but it became the BIA school. And that's the location where the community building now sits on. And for years, you know, Native people said that property belonged to the Native people. So one time I just got busy and went to the old Sitka Sentinel and read where an agreement was made that the town of Sitka, the city council made an agreement with the A and B. After the BIA school closed, the city was going to take over, not take over, but use that building. They could use it as long as it was being used for education. And no headway was ever made. So I found the write-up in the Sitka Sentinel in 1947 and took it, and I was a member of the city tribal council at the time, and I took those papers to the meeting and presented to the Bureau Assembly in our the meeting that we usually had over dinner, and they accepted it, and that's how that building was returned to the natives. And there was a copy of the Sentinel, the story that was printed.
So it was an empty lot at that point, wasn't it?
Yes,
The
by then
building
it
had
was
gone.
empty.
Yeah.
And the community, Sitka community always claimed it, but when we had the presentation, there was no argument with the Sentinel about who owned it. Now I might mention that Fred Reeder was mayor, and he was pleased to say that they would do what they could to return it. And it was done very quickly.
So what years did you attend that school? What years did you attend? Were you in kindergarten, or I guess it would start with first grade? When did you go?
To school?
Yeah.
In those days, it was called beginners. I went as a beginner. When you're promoted, you went to the 8th grade. And I was very fortunate because the school got a new principal. Last name was Wolfe, W-O-L-F-E, Raymond Wolfe, and his wife, Mrs. Wolfe. They were educators. You went to school, at that school you got an education. We were also fortunate because we had Laura Walton was one of our teachers. Lila Strand, the mother of Martin Strand, was another teacher. Flora Jacobs, Mark Jacobs Sr.'s sister, was another teacher. Another teacher was Amber Demers, and they were native. And at the time, I used to wonder, how could these native people treat us so mean? They were tough and strict. Years later, I understood why they did it and what they had done. And if you did wrong, you were punished. Everybody was punished consistently. There was no favoritism.
How were you punished?
Staying after school, working around the school building, or when you were little, you stuck out your hand, you got hit with a ruler real hard, and it hurt. I had that happen a few times.
Do you remember what your offense was? What did you do?
I was doing work on the chalkboard, and one of my friends erased it. So I went and erased his, I got caught. I was the one punished. He did not get punished. He was one of those I mentioned, had a difficult time with the language and didn't go very far. He was not a dumb person, but lack of understanding made it difficult.
So he might have been what we call now acting out. Like we call that now acting out, when kids are frustrated and so they'll do something naughty. But that's something and
Yeah.
that so
Yeah,
it sounds like he might have been responding to not.
We had some
Yeah.
boys who were bullies, you know, he ended up in fights he didn't want. It didn't happen often, but it did happen. And I might mention that this principal, we had a good education from them, but they also made school fun. They introduced activities that attracted all of us where we wanted. We didn't want to miss school. Those activities occurred after school or in the evening. There were things for the girls, things for the boys, or included everyone. Like Boy Scouts and basketball, track, campfire girls, Girl Scouts for the girls. And for the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts, they took the groups out for outings for several days.
So where was basketball played when you were a kid?
At Sheldon Jackson, or Sitka High. Sitka High had an old gym that was torn down not too many years ago.
So were all of the teachers native?
No,
Oh,
no, we had 2 or 3 who were not. But they were all strict, they had discipline. But they were outstanding teachers.
so was Laura Walton, was she a daughter of Rudolph Walton?
Yes, no, she was the wife of Bill Walton, who was the son of Rudolph Walton. She was a good teacher. And those teachers with the principal made certain every year the school put on major productions, music productions, at Christmas and the spring. It involved most of the school.
So the native public school or the BIA school
BIA school.
put on musical productions?
Oh yes,
Do you remember what some of the productions were?
Pinafore was one. And one, I'm not sure the name of, Jack and the Beanstalk. A lot of effort went into those programs.
So I thought and then didn't Sheldon Jackson do HMS Pinafore?
Oh yes, years later. And they did a great job. Herb Diedrichson was part of it.
So where were these where were the BIA musicals put
In the
on?
A&B hall. That's before the A&B remodeled. You know, the hall that we remember was much longer. Several years ago, they moved that stage out. It used to go back quite a ways. And the entrance was closer to the street. It was big enough, it was a major place to play basketball. It was much bigger than what you see today.
So they just filled it in?
Yes.
Or okay. Oh.
One of the things you wrote down was the cottage relationship to Sheldon Jackson. It was a very good and strong relationship. It was almost like we belonged to Sheldon Jackson, because Sheldon Jackson always seemed to have programs. We mentioned Pinafore. A lot of things like that took place where we were involved and were part of the audience. And one of the statements he wrote was growing up at the Cottages. It was a very clean place. The people kept it tidy. And that was the days before sewers modernized the village. So the beach, Totem Park, was a good place to play. Totem Park was a good place to play. A lot of time was spent in those places. Indian River was a great place, especially when the salmon was coming in. Millions of salmon used to come in every year. Millions, the length of the river. And we just sat on the banks and watched them. When there was no salmon, that's where we fished for trouts and had a picnic with what we caught. The whole river was a place to play. And a lot of times that's where we took our bath. We just jumped into the Indian River.
So did very many families leave town for the summer?
Oh yes,
Okay.
a lot of families, Perth sailing was big those days. There were canneries. The nearest was Todd Cannery. The next was Chatham. They're close to each other in Peril Straits. And below that on Admiralty Island was Tyee. Near Angoon was Hood Bay. North of Chatham Cannery was Tenakee. And across, well then there's Excursion Inlet.
So did the Cottages families mostly go to one of those
Yeah,
places, or?
The favorite places were Todd and Chatham. I guess because of the proximity. Tyee at the end of Admiralty Island was a good place. Fall fishing took place there and our families went to Tyee, as did many families.
So that would be the James family and
Yes,
then your
James,
family?
the Hope family. And when you went, we didn't go to those places in the summer, but families that went were gone the whole summer.
So your family didn't go?
No, didn't go. Another thing that people used to do, which we did not do, families would go out what we called camping, and they'd put up smoked salmon or dried fish. When the Wolf couple came, they put a stop to it, because you're supposed to be in school, not out camping. And if you weren't in school, they went after you.
So, but wouldn't that interfere with putting up food?
Yes, it did, but they felt education was more important. And the school had monitors that went and knocked on doors, and Herb was one of those.
Herb Diedrichson?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So being one of the older students would be recruited to
remind the families that they're supposed to be in school.
So this would be kind of end of the summer, like when would camping and school overlap? So that would be like August, September.
Those days were September. Parsening usually started around 4th of July, and sometimes it ran up to September. We talked about growing up in cottages. I mentioned another place that was a popular place to play was from the Sage Building to Totem Park. That was a good place to play. That was also a good place to swim. Then out in Sawmill Creek area was also a good place to swim.
So when you were growing up, was the road to, like, what year did you leave to go to the Wrangell Institute?
Fall of 1944.
So the military, because the military built their road somewhere in there, didn't they?
Did they what?
The military, didn't they build a bridge?
No, the main road to Sawmill Creek was down Lincoln, then up Metlakatla Street, then there's a bridge. Then that road was curving, and that was the main road. So when they were constructing the base, big trucks ran up almost 24 hours a day hauling gravel and rock right past our home. And we played on that street. But that traffic, when I look back, was not bothersome. It didn't bother us. Yet those trucks ran, I believe, 24 hours a day.
So they would have driven down Lincoln Street and just onto the beach, or through
They
the
ran
park?
from out around Jamestown, well, near the mouth of Indian River, down Metlakatla Street, Lincoln Street, and down to the oil dock that's at the foot of Lincoln Street. That's where they're dumping the gravel and rocks onto barges. They took them over to the island, and there was a big rock bunker on the island. Old pictures will show that's where they dumped the rock and gravel, and trucks were on the other side delivering them where they needed to go.
Oh.
And the military did not think helped Sitka High School in enrollment because the military were all young men. The construction workers who came here were all young men, single men mostly.
And yeah, so how, let's see, so you did attend Sheldon Jackson for a
Yes,
short
very
time?
briefly. When I was in grade school, finishing, I keep mentioning Herb, but I remember a bunch of us sitting together in the old BIA school near the end of our 8th grade year. They were all talking about going to Sheldon Jackson or Wrangell Institute. Wrangell was the forerunner to Mount Edgecumbe. And I didn't talk about going to either school because the tuition at Sheldon Jackson for boys was $60 a year. And of course, $60 was a lot of money.
So all those boys had earned money, or?
I don't know how they paid, but they were we were required if we went. So my going to SJ was out of the question. And I didn't plan on going to Wrangell because you had to pay the fare. There was no charge to go there except the fare. So I was up on the campus when Herb and my friends were all moving into Sheldon Jackson. The school was starting next day. And they were moving into the small boys' dorm, Fraser Hall. And I envied them and felt real bad. So next morning I was taking the shortcut from where we lived through the campus, was walking by Fraser Hall. When the head of the dormitory, Fraser Hall, Miss Ora Kuykendall, grabbed me by the arm and asked what I was doing. And I thought I was in trouble. And I tried to explain to her. She said, "You come with me." She took me into Fraser Hall and said, "You stay right here, I'll be right back." In a few minutes she was back. She said, "You run on home and get your clothes. You're going to live in this building." She showed me the room. She said, "When you get here, this is going to be your bed." So, and next day I met with Les Yaw, and he said, "You will have to work for the school 1 month after school is out to pay for your tuition." And the person I was going to work with was Peter Simpson. So that's how I ended up at Sheldon Jackson.
Wow.
But the next year I went to Wrangell Institute. And there was a big difference between the two schools. I felt at Wrangell Institute that I fit in better with the student body because most were in similar situations that I was in. Many were poor, and a good number did not have parents.
Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So at Sheldon Jackson, most of the kids came from families.
Yeah, most
who were
did,
more
but there were
substantial.
some who did not have parents. Like a good number went to Sheldon Jackson from the Haynes house, and most of them were orphans. But there were students like that at Sheldon Jackson, but there seemed to be more at Wrangell Institute. And there were some differences between Wrangell Institute and Sheldon Jackson. And the big difference I saw had to do with the teaching staff. At Wrangell Institute, they were younger and energetic and were involved in student activities, being sponsors, advisors. When I was at Sheldon Jackson, they were older and were not that involved. And I would say because of the makeup of the students, the teachers at Wrangell were really there to counsel and were encouraging the students to go on. Don't stop when you finish high school. And some of the same teachers came to Edgecumbe, by the way, when Edgecumbe opened for the first time. That was one of the biggest differences, but the quality of teaching, there was little difference because both places had good teachers.
So was the Wrangell Institute, was that BIA?
It was BIA. It closed because it was overcrowded. And it's a long story I won't get into because it involved the opening of Mount Edgecumbe. And what I saw being involved at Mount Edgecumbe, but how students were accepted. I can't speak for Sheldon Jackson, but I know at Mount Edgecumbe during the BIA days, when you looked at an application, first thing you saw, can this student graduate in 4 years? If we took him, will that student graduate? If their grades were so poor, we did not accept them. But if things were even, the next question was, can we help the student? Regardless of how bad the application might have looked, we always asked that question, can this school help? Was never asked, will this student help the school? That was the way the BIA was, so we ended up taking a lot of students that probably other schools would not take because we had the faith that the school could help these students. And I might mention that the school succeeded with many, but failed in others, but not for lack of trying.
So do you feel like the kids who failed, it was from their previous schooling, or like what were the factors that helped the kid? What were the factors that helped a student succeed or fail?
Well, I don't know why Edgecumbe is like a family, but it is a family, and I think it's being together. How they gain strength and courage. We've had, and I hate to say this, but we've had students from Sitka going over there and did real well, whereas they were not at Sitka. And I think a lot of it's the environment. And sometimes I think they are ignored, whereas at Edgecumbe, very few are ignored. If a student not doing well, you call the student in and you try to find out. Sometimes you have to get after them. But the interest is shown. Interest in the student.
So was that your choice to go to Wrangell Institute instead of trying to stay at SJ?
What's that?
So you went to Sheldon Jackson for a year, and then was that your choice? You decided to go to Wrangell Institute instead?
I also want to go to Wrangell Institute. And it has to do with their basketball team came up here. It's the first game I'd seen. And they played Sheldon Jackson. They beat Sheldon Jackson, a great Sheldon Jackson team, by 2 points. And from then I want to go to Wrangell Institute. And ended up going as I had hoped. And there too, things were still hard. And I forgot that it cost money to get on Alaska steamship. I applied, was accepted, then told the BIA principal here that I had changed my mind. A few days later, he was looking for me. He said, your ticket is here. I got on the steamship, went to Wrangell. Years later, that man ended up in the Pioneers' home. And he sent for me, I went to see him. And he said, I want to tell you this. He said, Art Franken did not want you to know, but Art Franken paid for your transportation to Wrangell. And I might mention that Art Franken was one of my best friends years later. And I never knew he had done that until he passed away. Now I might mention I have a picture of Art Franken, 8 by 10, hanging up in my home. And he's wearing a school sweater. that Mount Edgecumbe, Sheldon Jackson, and Sitka gave him. The letters are all on honoring him for all his support.
Wow. So you went to Sheldon Jackson for a year, and you grew up in the Cottages. So what kind of relationship did you have to Sheldon Jackson after that?
It took a few years because I was getting my feet, getting grounded in education as a teacher. But after I got the hang of it, I became involved in other activities. But I always had interest in Sheldon Jackson. And many times, knew the struggles they were going through, how hard money was. So the first opportunity that I had to support them, I accepted. And that went on for a good number of years, always supporting them, their activities, and whatever they were doing, even if it just meant being there. But then it got a little harder for Sheldon Jackson, and that's when other groups that became more interested, I became involved with different task forces and committees that was trying to help them to see what they could do or we could do to help them through financial problems. And that was several years. And these groups met, and it included all walks of life, trying to tell Sheldon Jackson what they need to do to get out of the situation they were in financially.
So what years would those have been? So it's like 1960s?
Before that.
Or even in the 1950s?
I might mention one of their big reunions. I was given a certificate and plaque as an honorary Sheldon Jackson alumnus, plus a sweatshirt that says that. It's also hanging up in one of my rooms.
So.
And your dad was involved in that a whole lot, and I was part of some of that with the practice house, Allen Auditorium, a piece of property that your dad helped people, to buy into it and gave it to Sheldon Jackson. But one of the first things I did was to write to all the Native organizations trying to get financial support. And sadly, only one responded, and that was Cake. The Sitka community, the Sitka tribal, they handle all the mail out to all of these organizations and alumni seeking assistance, but there's no response.
So when was that? That was when there were Native corporations?
Yes, and different corporations and organizations like Sitka Tribal.
So that was like in the late 70s? Or?
Yes, late 70s, and then late 80s, and again in the 90s. And the difference between, we got no response from Sheldon Jackson alumni, and the difference when Mount Edgecumbe was, when we were trying to reopen it, the Sitka tribe began to handle stacks of mail out to the alumni to bombard the legislature. And I was told a stack of papers that high reached Juneau, that putting the pressure on legislators. And big in pushing that was Al Adams, who was a great, great supporter of Edgecumbe, probably the biggest.
So why do you suppose that, well, I guess everything if I could have your perspective on first of all, why Sheldon Jackson was struggling, and then why do you suppose there wasn't that alumni support?
Excuse me, I think Sheldon Jackson was struggling. This came up in some of our task force meetings where they said it's fine to have a minister being president. Said we have no problem with that. The problem that we see is you need a business person who can go out and seek financial help, donations from different corporations, said the school needs such a person. Such a person I don't think was ever a part of the school. But that came up a good number of times. Another thing that came out in those meetings was that Sheldon Jackson needed to let people know what's going on. We need something coming out of the school to make the public aware. And the big difference in the alumni is the biggest support for Edgecumbe is the alumni. The alumni there brags about the school, and they like to say, we are family. And that's really what it is. You go to Alaska Federation of Natives Convention, you see that in their reunions. It's a fun time.
So the something about Sheldon Jackson just didn't have that family feeling?
I was up there twice when they had reunions. I didn't go. But even people who went, who were graduates of Sheldon Jackson, felt real bad. They said it failed. They said, we just don't know how to have fun. And I don't know what it is. And even I went to some of the meetings when Sheldon Jackson alumni in Anchorage was talking about the big reunion, 100th anniversary, 1878. Most, excuse me, were saying they were donating money, but they kept saying no religion. And I was puzzled by that, and I'm still puzzled. But when the reunion took place, it was different. Going to chapel and the church services were the highlights at Sheldon Jackson. Most went, and really I think had a good time going to those church services. But it gets back, I think, to, matter of fact, I reading about Al Adams just before I came here on the internet. For one of his classmates said he called Al Adams up in the legislature, and he said this is Ray Scan. So when Al answered, the first thing he did, he was singing the Mount Edgecumbe School song. And that Ray Scan said that's what he remembers about Al. That he's expressing the loyalty that Albert had. That's the best word, was the alumni, the loyalty to the school.
Wow, so...
You go to the state tournaments of Edgecumbe's in it. The whole pavilion is Edgecumbe people.
So Mount Edgecumbe was never religious, right? Never...
But there was religion. When the BIA ran it, they had religious instruction every Tuesday night. Students were free to go, they didn't have to go, but everybody went. Sunday night got so big they had to use the auditorium for the Sunday services. It was a big part. And even the lunches at Sundays were started later to accommodate students who were going to school, church on this side.
So
Now I might mention a good number of boys became ministers from Edgecumbe.
So what do you suppose went wrong with the I guess school spirit at Sheldon Jackson?
Sheldon Jackson had the school spirit. Why, after they got out, what happened to it, I'm not sure. I can't answer that. And I used to watch the student body at Sheldon Jackson, sing their school songs. You knew they were proud of Sheldon Jackson, the way they sang it. And you asked about the relationship between the two schools. I think the presence of one made the other a better school. I know being at Edgecumbe, They worked hard to be good because they didn't want to be outdone by Sheldon Jackson. But it was a good relationship, a good rivalry. There was friendships on both sides of the channel.
And then somebody was telling me the other day that the Sheldon Jackson boats were used to bring students to Mount Edgecumbe. So was there, how did that work?
If that happened, I'm not aware of it.
Oh, okay. So this would have been in
Because
the
the early days, Sheldon Mount Edgecumbe had their own boat, a big surplus military vessel. But if Sheldon Jackson did that, I'm unaware of it. But I do know that the schools before I became an administrator did work very closely together on a lot of issues and things that would be beneficial to both. And one was like keeping Sheldon Jackson students away from Edgecumbe and Edgecumbe students away from SJ.
why would they do that?
Well, it interfered with the programs. The girls had a lot to do with it. It was boys mostly.
I see. So the Sheldon Jackson boys
Yeah,
away
and
from.
Mount
I
Edgecumbe
see.
boys. But as far as being bitter rivalry, there was none of that.
Were you aware of any of clans when you were growing up?
Any what?
Of clans, like of what clan you were of?
No. We knew. I didn't mention this with our family, but the highlight of our family, and we were poor, was when we sat down for our meals, especially in the evening, where our mother told us things like what clans we belonged to, our Tlingit names, who were related to clan-wise. We learned it in the home, but it was never discussed outside the home. I never heard it in school or from friends. In those days, it didn't seem important. And what you need to remember too, that organizations like A and B were pushing to get into, the mainstream. Matter of fact, their preamble does mention that they leave the native state into the higher culture. That's not the way it's stated, but that's what it means.
So did you, when you were growing up, I don't know if you, like, how did you feel about Tlingit culture? Was it just that it wasn't important, or did you feel
We never thought about it.
just wasn't part of your life?
No, it all gets back to being too busy. We had to work hard as young people, getting back to subsistence. Had to fish, get food, but we never heard about culture. It's really something that's relatively new. And it had nothing to do with us being told not, to speak the language. I never heard that, couldn't speak the language. But we worked hard as young people to provide food, and didn't mention packing water, cutting wood and then chopping wood. It was never ended. We weren't the only family. All the families were doing the same thing.
So you're, so are you the youngest in your family?
But
Are you the youngest in your family?
no, my youngest was the sister named Mildred. She died about 4 years ago. Corrine, the next, died about not quite a year ago.
So after your mother passed away, or what did your mother die of?
She was murdered.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Wow. At
Unsolved.
at downtown or
Yes.
in? Oh my gosh.
You're
So,
the first one I'm saying this to. Never mentioned that before.
wow. So how many siblings were still at home?
I was the only one. I had an older brother, but he was of no help. It was a very difficult time because my sister Nancy was sent to Wrangell Institute. And that's another reason why I said I fit in more with Wrangell than I did SJ, because there were many such students. Some of my best friends were in the same situation I was in, ended up playing with the basketball team at Edgecumbe and Wrangell. But very difficult. Nancy was sent to Wrangell, and my next youngest, Alvin, Jake, and Corrine, were taken by a distant relative in Wrangell, and that was very difficult. And the youngest, Mildred, she was taken by the Catlyan family here in Sitka. But this was not unusual. There were my closest friend. All the years, he died recently. He was in the same fix,
Who was,
as were a good number of my friends went through the same thing.
so because of early deaths of parents?
Yes, and that may be another reason why the student body early years of Edgecumbe was drawn so close together, because we understood that most, had difficult lives.
So was it mostly, did most people lose their parents due to illness and disease, accidents, alcohol?
All of it, yeah. Yeah, one of my closest friends, I won't mention his name, I spoke at his funeral a few years ago. Actually, about 2 years ago. His father was walking on the beach, and a guy came out with a rifle and just shot him for no reason. And I remember we were at Wrangell together when he left to go home because of that.
A beach like in downtown? Or
Yeah, his village south of here,
in a village?
Cake. And the
So-
man who shot his father had a daughter who was very close to all of us, and she suffered over it.
So
So
did
those
he,
were things like that that happened that,
so the man who did it, did he end up going to prison? Or?
yes, he went to prison.
So was it something where alcohol was involved?
No, that he just, people don't know why he did it.
Wow. Yeah, I read Carol Feller Brady's book,
Mhm.
and that was a little window into those times with.
Yeah, we grew up together. She's just like a sister. Yeah, she wrote about it, and I never wrote about it, never talked about it, except here. Matter of fact, it was just several months ago I told my youngest sister, Corrine, who died not too long ago, just what I'm telling you now about our family. She never knew. My own children don't know.
So is that because you feel like it's more important to, like why
Well,
do you
I
feel?
will tell them, yes.
Um, wow.
Now, mentioning all that, Well, I guess one of the reasons I like sports because we're able to do things and it didn't cost anything, kept our mind on something, it gave us something to look forward to.
Wow. So you can see where some people, it would be too much for some people, experiencing that kind of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Well, things been happening just recently that's real hard, like Al Adams. He was a good person. Had friends been, dying the last few weeks. But like my sister said, you just can't dwell on it. You have to move on.
Yeah, and I think it probably was too much for some.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned that some of the great leaders, started at the cottages. Now I would say Peter Simpson was the number one person. And I've always been amazed, that for all that he's done, things that he promoted, he is not held in that high esteem like with Sea Alaska.
And why do you suppose, or why do you think he's not more prominent?
That's a real good question. I don't know why. Same with A and B. Because he was the one who really pushed for the A and B. And is the one who put the bug in the ear of A and B that this land is yours. You need to fight for it.
So do you think some of it might have been when people were rediscovering culture, where, when people, like in the 1970s, when people are rediscovering the culture, whether there might have been some, that might have been some of the division, where they would not have wanted to acknowledge leaders who advocated moving away from the culture?
When he was advocating that was years ago, around what I read, around 1911, when he spoke to the student body at Sheldon Jackson. But it's well documented in books. One is a good book to read about Peter Simpson, that Soul American, by Donald Mitchell. That gives a good account of his speech to the students at Sheldon Jackson and how he pushed real hard to move on to what he said, to the new life. Get away from the old. And he did state to get away from being a native. Take your place, and because the time is coming where education is going to mean a lot.
So I wonder if that could be why he's not.
I'm not.
Is because of, I mean,
No,
if
that
that's,
that book came out not too many years ago. I really don't. And I talked to some of the Sea Alaska board members, and they all thought I said something should be done. They thought it was a good idea, but they said, write me a letter. I wrote the letters. There's no response. And even locally here in Sitka, I made recommendations to honor Peter Simpson. And yet I don't think he saw the poster I did. It's quite big, of Sitka A&B basketball, of all the teams and players. And Peter Simpson's in the middle.
Where can I get a
Yeah.
copy of that?
Hmm?
Where can I get a copy?
I could give you a copy. His picture's in the middle. It's done to honor his memory because of what he did for Native people. He started Sitka A&B basketball, started basketball at Sheldon Jackson. And that's what I said under his picture. I got some criticism from people who were upset that I didn't mention that he was Simpson. I never heard Peter Simpson talk about being Simpson, but that wasn't the purpose of that poster.
My mind.
I did it and Andy Hope saw. And we got money to get it printed. Different organizations contributed. And we ended up giving those posters away.
What was it like? So you taught you learned boat building with you took Peter Simpson's class and built boats. What was that like?
It was one of the most interesting things I've ever done. Every day was different. Every day was a challenge. And he was a good instructor.
So
We
what?
built round bottom boats, V bottom boats, and just flat bottom boats. And he taught us how to use tools and to treat them properly, how to sharpen them, and how to put them back when you're done, not to let them lay around.
I wonder where he learned boat building.
I have no idea, but he was very important to a lot of us when we were young.
So did you work during the school year for Sheldon Jackson? Was that part of the program then?
Yeah, I was in boat shop half a day. And one of the reasons I decided to leave Sheldon Jackson because I really enjoyed boat building and had hoped to make a career, but they moved me out of shop because they said others need a chance. Well, more than one person was needed, and I was the only one in class. Boys weren't signing up for it
This was at Sheldon Jackson.
at Sheldon Jackson.
So you were building boats the first part of the year and then not later, or how?
No, we were building boats all the time because we were building rowboats, round bottom boats, B bottom, flat bottom, because the school had a working agreement with the Navy. They were taking as many as we could build. And it was always kind of sad when the Navy came and took those boats, but they were making money for the school.
Oh, the rowboats that you would build.
Yes, it was money for the school.
And then, I didn't understand about you were thinking about going into boat building?
That's something at the time I was thinking I would like to do.
And then why didn't that work out?
Because I went to Wrangell Institute and was encouraged to go on to college. And I was doing a lot of artwork, and they thought I'd be good artist, journalism. And for a long time, that's the direction I was thinking. But I was encouraged at Edgecumbe to come back as a teacher. And that's where that was planted. That was one of the big differences, how teachers over there encourage students to go on.
And you don't think Sheldon Jackson?
I didn't get that
School
Sheldon
was-
Jackson because maybe they didn't see, that I might have that. I do know they did encourage others. Because many went on, and did real well. Many became teachers.
And
and ministers, Henry Fawcett being a good one.
So, and then, if you're game, maybe tell us about how you came to Mount Edgecumbe, like how Mount Edgecumbe High School started, and how you went from Wrangell Institute to Edgecumbe. I mean, if you've got the energy.
We were getting ready to go on a basketball trip to Wrangell. We were going to be heading to Ketchikan, Metlakatla. Matter of fact, we were downtown Wrangell already aboard the seine boat, and we saw the superintendent's car going fast. He's probably breaking the law. And the coach said, "Let's wait, maybe he wants to see us." So he jumped out of his car and said, "The move," and it was the first time we heard it, "the big move is starting." He said, "We're all moving to Sitka." It turned out with the fresh sophomores and juniors who were moving here. And he said, "I need volunteers." He said, you and you. The plane is already on its way. You'll get aboard. Then he pointed to me and said, "You and others will get on the second plane." And he said, "Don't worry about your luggage. We'll take care of it." 6 weeks later, our luggage came. The only thing we had was what we wore. So you took a shower and washed your clothes at the same time.
So why?
It goes back even farther. A man by the name of Don Foster. He was head of the BIA in Juneau and heard that the naval base was going to be surplus. And he knew that Wrangell Institute was too small. He knew that the BIA school in Edgecumbe was too small. So he worked hard to get the school, and the base. He got the base. It was scheduled to open in the fall of 1947. But that was one of the coldest winters Alaska's had. There was a hospital, BIA hospital, TB hospital in Skagway. It froze up. Edgecumbe up in Anchorage froze up. So it was decided that it'd be a lot easier to open the school in February than September, than to repair all the damage. That's why we moved here. The Edgecumbe students came on a steamship.
So Eklutna was a TB hospital?
The BIA school.
It was a school, okay.
BIA school. And the patients from Skagway also moved here. So the first group of students came from Wrangell, February 22nd, 1947. I have pictures of them. And also the Alaska steamship that brought the Edgecumbe students. I have pictures of them coming down the gangplank. And they grew up at Edgecumbe, as did everybody who came those years. Edgecumbe was home. But the reason Edgecumbe opened is Wrangell Institute was too crowded. Edgecumbe had frozen up, and the TB hospital in Skagway needed a bigger place. So that's how the TB and the hospital opened at Edgecumbe. You look at old newspapers, Skagway put up quite a fight to hold on to the hospital. And it was something for Wrangell and Edgecumbe students to come together. And I always felt the thing that brought the student body together immediately were basketball games that the Edgecumbe team played. We were over there 1 hour, and every team from Sitka was over there asking to play us. Basketball season had ended. So we decided we had part of our Wrangell Institute team came up, underclassmen. I was one of them. So we checked with the superintendent. He thought it was a good idea. But we had no uniforms, no balls. A and B loaned us their uniforms and their basketball. And we played every team but A and B. And they were the first team to ask.
So
and their colors were cardinal and gold. And I think it had a lot to do with what Edgecumbe picked. But that's why Edgecumbe opened.
So what was the man's name from Juneau?
Don Foster.
Don Foster.
He's another individual who was never given credit. But he was the one responsible for getting Mount Edgecumbe open.
So what was the facility like when you came there? Because it
What
had
was
been
it?
closed, because it was shut down in 46? And then you came in-
44.
Okay.
The military moved out in 44.
So that's several years of no maintenance, no heat. What were
It
the
was in good
facilities
shape.
like?
The buildings were in good shape. But there were no desks, no chairs, so you sat on the floor in the classroom. It was strictly military, bunks, row after row. And I think that's another thing that brought students closer together. You knew everybody on your floor. The bunks were about that far apart.
So it was just a barracks, one
Just
big
barracks,
room.
Navy barracks,
So one big room.
one floor, that's nothing but, and of course the showers were in the middle of the building.
So what about the recreation building, the one with that eagle sculpture in front of it now? What was that?
The Navy gym, well, the floor was in bad shape. So a number of us went to the superintendent, Max Penrod, and said we'd like to use the gym and we'd like to get busy to sanding the floor. And about 200 boys showed up and we had a little spot. In no time we had the floor sanded. The next night we varnished it and then put 3 coats on. In about 2 weeks we played our first game in that gym. We also built a softball field that the community uses. There was a big warehouse there, nothing but junk piled sky high. The boys organized and the workers volunteered to help. We loaded those trucks and dumped all that stuff and also tore the warehouse down, used shovels and put it on the dump trucks, took it to the field and spread it out and did that hour after hour until we had a softball field.
So is that the softball field that's there now?
What's there now is a big improvement. The community, Sitka, built it.
But that's the location?
Yes, the location. But students those days were different than today's students.
Well,
Well, good example, the students liked herring, but it's too big of a, to cook, to fry, too big of a job for the kitchen because there's no way to get it. So a number of us came over. We went to see Bill Walton. And he said he'll talk to Mark Jacobs. And that lagoon where the boat harbors used to be loaded with herring. So Mark Jacobs and Bill Walton helped the boys with a seine and caught the herring and put it on a boat, unloaded, and the boys and girls cleaned herring, I don't know how long, and they helped cook the herring. That's because the students wanted herring. Today, I don't know if you can get students to do that.
yeah, I wonder if some of it is the students then would have known such hardship that I wonder, it's like the upside of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Boy.
No, that type of life never ended at Edgecumbe. There were always, students. And I've said many times, they were the best young people to work with.
When did you, or maybe you can tell me a little bit about your education and career, like after you graduated from Mount Edgecumbe.
I had a lot of encouragement from 3 teachers at Edgecumbe. And I always said, if I teach, that's where I want to be. Because I saw them not only being good teachers, what I saw a great deal of, they were working after hours, helping students in student activities.
Who were those teachers?
Mrs. Ripley, I don't know if you remember her. The basketball coach, Clyde Larrabee. And the math teacher, Anna Hart. And 2 young ladies, Grace Ushler and Joyce Nicolai. They were good teachers, but they were visible after hours, working with students in activities. I never gave up wanting to go to school, and it's a long story how I ended up in Arkansas, but mostly because of a man I played basketball with. He's preacher for Church of Christ and was a former student of that college. I was also already writing a lot of letters to different colleges, and he heard about it, so he wrote to that college, and the coaches down there wrote me letters, and I decided that's where I was going to go.
What was the school?
What?
What was the name of your school?
Harding University, Church of Christ. Very conservative and strict, and just like Edgecumbe when I was there. I always said, rules shouldn't bother anybody. It's those people who break them are the ones against the rules. If you're doing what you're supposed to, you don't know their rules or laws.
Well, and the rules must have been very clear.
They were, and consistent. No favoritism.
Were most of the faculty at Mount Edgecumbe a particular denomination, or were they all different?
Different, yeah. At Edgecumbe, yeah, they were different. And a lot of them went to church. We saw them in church.
So when you went there, when you went to Edgecumbe, did you go to church there, like chapel, or did you come across?
On Tuesday night and Sunday night. Sunday services in the morning, you went to your own church.
In town?
In town. Mm-hmm. More than half the student body went to church.
All different churches?
All different churches.
So what was your degree in from Harding?
My major was history and physical education.
And then did you have to get teaching?
Yes, I got the Bachelor of Arts and I got the teaching certificate, and was lucky to be hired when I inquired.
So you came right back to...
Came right back, yeah.
And then what was your career at Edgecumbe?
A great experience. I taught history 20 years, taught PE a little while, then got into administration. Like I said a while ago, I had a good bunch of young people.
So, and had you retired when the school closed?
I retired in 1990, the last day of August.
So you were at the school when it was a BIA school, and then...
Yes. It was a sad day when the BIA closed it. Closed in '83. People held up good until graduation. But I never gave up. I always felt the school was too good, to remain closed. And for a long time it was very discouraging. And I also mentioned that there was, but John Hope and I went to talk to Ted Stevens to plead with him to keep it open. Of course, I don't know what he had to do with it, but when we got there, he refused. He said it's a done deal. He said it's closing. That's what we kept hearing. And then Frank Mikowski, running for U.S. Senate, came to see the administration, Lee Demert, myself, and Larry Welch, and said if he's elected, Edgecumbe's going to be his #1 priority to keep it open. It was supposed to close in 1982, but we got a telex from him at Christmas '81 that the school was given an additional year, so it would remain open to give people like him a chance to see what can be done. We announced it to the student body, and I, to this day, will say I never heard any louder cheering than I did, even at ball game, than I did that announcement. And then we started hearing things that Ted Stevens had joined with him. And then Don Young. Don Young was a little silent up to that point. So we were told that $22 million was going to be appropriated to renovate Edgecumbe and spend some of it for the hospital. But it's going to be up to the state. Sheffield was governor at the time, and he was strongly for Edgecumbe, made it known. Then Steve Cooper was elected. Steve was like Cooper. They wanted Edgecumbe open, but now it's going to be up to the state. That's when Al Adams became the most important person, because Al Adams was, at the time, he's head of finance committee in the House. And a student body, or a student from Sheldon Jackson, former student, and I did not mention him, John Sackett, was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. So I talked to Al Adams. The school honored Al with a plaque a couple of years ago. And of course, I always talked to Al Adams when he was around. But he is the one who put the package together that was going to reopen Edgecumbe. So John Sackett took it to the Senate. And Al Adams pushed hard. And Al Adams was a good legislator. He got along with people because he worked with people and was honest with people. So he got a lot of support. And that's where the alumni became important. We started contacting them, and they started contacting their legislator. And I should mention that Dick Eliason, named by Al Adams, as a hard worker to get Edgecumbe reopened. And we got a lot of phone calls from Dick Eliason and Al Adams informing us of the progress being made in the legislature.
So when it closed, was it for sure that it was going to reopen again? Or
No.
was there some
The
time in there?
legislature had to approve it. And that's where Ernestine Massey, she was chairperson of the, the Board of Education. And she handled very smoothly. And there were hearings held all over Alaska, and that's where you saw the alumni come out in force. And the legislature agreed to reopen the school. But there were a lot of people besides those I mentioned. There were many who went and testified, some who went to D.C. to talk to Stevens. At the time, he became important because he was holding back. But it really began with Frank Mikowski. And I've always told Senator Mikowski that.
So I wonder if it had to do, because you hear about, you hear all these horror stories about BIA schools down south. And I wonder if that was some of why they just wanted to close them all.
I think they're trying to save money.
Oh.
But the worst part of it, we had a good school, and there were schools on it that were horrible. We had visited them. But the reason Edgecumbe was taken, those schools down south had just been rebuilt, and a lot of money went into remodeling. So Edgecumbe closed. Wasn't that we were doing a bad job. It was just a school that was handy to close. And I might mention someone very important, Kathy Sutton. She had students write letters, hundreds of letters, to alumni and anybody they thought would help. Now, I remember the student body coming into my office one night, and she just cried and said she just can't go on. And yet she worked hard. She went to different groups up north asking for support. But they wrote hundreds of letters under direction of Kathy Sutton. So when Frank McCoskey came to meet with us administrators, he said, and he knew I went to Edgecumbe, he said, if you had asked, he said, I probably wouldn't have listened. And he pointed to Lee Demmert and said, if you asked, I probably would not have listened. But he said, when a student in school writes me a letter asking for help, he said that means something. And he pulled that letter out. And I asked him, who is it from? It was from that president of the student body. But as people say, more than one person, and that's true, there were many who had a part in it.
So what year did Edgecumbe open up again?
What's that?
What year did Edgecumbe reopen?
Yes.
Or what year?
It reopened September 30th, 1985. That was one of the conditions that was set by the government. It had to open in September. Matter of fact, construction people were moving out 2 hours before the students arrived. And the building still had to be cleaned. And they were cleaned.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any, because I think we've worked through all the questions I had. I don't know if you have anything to say about your perspective on Sheldon Jackson and why it failed in the end.
Well, of course, I said earlier, I was always interested and has always supported it, even with only attending activities. But I gave a talk on Founders Day at Edgecumbe and mentioned that we were very saddened when Sheldon Jackson closed. It was like someone in our family, because we got along with them, and I always, always respected the school for its mission and for some of the things I saw it accomplished. And I'm not so sure sometimes if they did reach their mission, but I respected what I felt to be their mission, and it had to do with religion.
How would you sum up what you feel their mission was?
What the school was?
Or their mission, like how would you phrase that, like what you felt their mission was?
I would say just in between, I'd say it was probably fair. Sometimes I don't think they quite reached their mission. It was based on going back to our being a part of task forces that met and tried to help Sheldon Jackson through the hard time, and religion came up, and I kind of felt it met with some lukewarm reception. But I do recall that I said religion's going to be part of what we were hoping would be a new school, new Sheldon Jackson, that if they're talking about religion, it had to start from the top and filter down to the students. That it can't be just a bunch of words. It's something that's an example, has to be set, and it starts from the top. As it does in any school. It starts with the superintendent. And I saw that over and over, about how schools follow a different path, sometimes not the right path, because of the superintendent, because of his goals. And of course, what I feel is the right path could be entirely different than someone else's.
So you feel like, do you think they had a clear idea of what their mission was?
No, I can't say that I think they had a clear idea.
So what do you think their mission was at its best? What do you think their mission was? Like, what was their mission at its best? Like,
Well, I'd say religion, but also education. Those two, I think, went together. It had to go together. To educate the young people, expose them to what they thought was the right thing, that's religion.
so religion would be, like how would that manifest itself? Like how would the religion be shown? Like by example?
By the way people lived, you live a good life.
So do you feel like some of them weren't living a good life, or that they weren't very good at sharing that?
Well, it wouldn't be just Sheldon Jackson people, I think it's all areas are not living good lives, and there are all areas. There are many living good lives.
So do you think they had that mission all the way up to the end? Or do you think they left their mission behind at some point? So do you think they actually, so did they keep on some part of their mission until they closed, or did they drop their mission at some point?
I really can't answer that because I don't know. I mean, they are the ones who could answer that, and maybe students who were there would have a good idea. If you asked me that question at Edgecumbe, I could answer very clearly, that.
So Mount Edgecumbe had a mission, or has a mission.
Who?
Mount Edgecumbe has a mission.
Yes, it had education. It changed depending on who was superintendent.
So do you think the Mount Edgecumbe mission had to do with Christian role modeling?
Education, teaching the students to make a living and to hold on to jobs. And encouraging them to go on. I hate to keep saying college, but that's what we pushed.
So do you feel like Mount Edgecumbe, or that Sheldon Jackson's special place might have been to have more religion in the school? Or?
I can't answer that because someone who went to Sheldon Jackson could answer that.
Yeah, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add, or?
No, I don't think so.
Well, thank you so much.
And sent them to Sandpoint, Washington. Now they're up in Anchorage. So all the student records are up in Anchorage.
And I heard a story that you actually, did you go to the landfill to pick up the class photos? The photographs? I had heard that those photos that are in the, the big photos with all the students,
Mm-hmm.
that those had been discarded or are going to be
Oh, yeah.
discarded. So what was the story of those?
I was a teacher at the time, and Mrs. Ripley was the supervisor. And she came to that building we were teaching in very upset and told us that the superintendent had those pictures taken down from the wall and taken to the dump. So my close friend Paul Pearson and I have gotten these pickup and made several trips and brought those pictures back to our building. And glasses were all broken, framed. And when Paul was gone, then I took care of those pictures, moved them every time we moved. But the last thing I did, the last 2 weeks I was at the school, I repaired every one of them. And I have to give Larry Rocheleau credit for letting me do that.
So what year was that? And who was the superintendent who got rid of them?
A guy by the name of Kenneth Kreitz, Krites.
Oh, why do you suppose he did
He
that?
said students were spending too much time looking at those pictures. I didn't hear him say that. Mrs. Ripley told me that. Now, I might mention my class was the first one to do that, the first picture. Matter of fact, I did it. And did it the next year at request of the class.
So you took the photos?
No.
Oh,
The Photoshop took the pictures. I did the artwork and cutting. And they're still there.
wow, that's great.
In all the years I tried to get the senior class to use those individual photos, but they had group pictures. And I told them that 3-4 years people won't recognize them. This administration has gone back to individual pictures. And
Wow.
all those pictures are in the auditorium.
Wow, that's great. So what year was that they were discarded? What about?
Let's see, about between 64 and 68. Well, 64, 67.
Wow. Yeah, that's
That's
great.
very important to the student body because they recognize parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles.
Yeah,